Hey guys, Frank Spear back with you for another episode of Watch This. Going to be a brief one today. I've been recently teaching a little bit about paradise and heaven, and I've mentioned in a couple of my other videos, my more recent videos, that the thrust, the crux of the Bible, the main point of it, is not the afterlife. What happens to us after we biologically die. That was my point. I never said in any video that there's no heaven, that there's no place to go in a supernatural realm after we die. Never said that. As a matter of fact, I say the exact opposite. I say only that the Bible is not mostly concerned about that. This is not a handbook on how to get to heaven after you die. If that were the thrust, you would see that all throughout the scriptures, from Genesis to Revelation. Hey, this life is kind of important, but what really matters is what happens after biological death and where you're going to go and what life is going to be like there, and the things you'll be doing there, and the kind of bodies you'll have, and who will be there, and how you get there, and where it is, and so forth. That's not the thrust of the Bible. The thrust of the Bible was one ancient nation's covenant relationship with God in an 800 square mile radius on planet Earth. That's the thrust and crux of the Bible. Is heaven ever mentioned? Is another sphere of existence ever mentioned? I believe it is. And I've talked about that in the video that I made yesterday and the day before. Look, there are things we can't figure out. Things we can't know for certain. Even we can study the Bible till we're proverbially blue in the face, and we're not going to understand who, what, where, when, why, and all that of the afterlife. But one of the main proponents of the Israel-only movement made a video yesterday, I believe, saying that he had heard that I had made videos saying there's no heaven, or the Bible doesn't talk at all about heaven or the afterlife. So he didn't even watch my videos, but he heard from someone else that I'm saying these things, and then he proceeded in his 20-minute video from yesterday to dismantle the straw man that once again he set up about what I'm saying. So I want to look at one particular passage that he mentioned. He says the Bible talks about the afterlife and heaven and going to an invisible realm and what it's going to be like there. It talks about that constantly. And then he gives a couple of passages, the very ones that I say in my videos that they always go to, which, he goes to 1 Thessalonians 4, of course, for the literal rapture and the literal resurrection from biological death, which I do not think it's talking about there. Fine, we disagree, no problem. But I say in my videos that there's one or two main passages they always go to, and he goes to those two. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4, neither of which I, nor many others, believe is talking about a literal resurrection from biological death out of the tombs, out of the literal graves where their corpses had rotted and they were skeletons there and they were going to literally come out from there. They never talk about how they would come out, since Abraham was thousands of years old in AD 70 in terms of his body, right, would be thousands of years old. It would have been utterly decomposed, but somehow he was going to come up out of the tomb, out of the cave at Machpelah, and he was going to rise up and go to be with the Lord. And they never talk about, well, I guess God would give him a body to come out of the grave with. Things like this. So they disregard all of that, and then they just laugh and say how ridiculous it is not to believe that. Then I talked about in my videos if there was a literal rapture, a disappearance, whether it was something you could see with your visible eyeballs and watch people float away into the sky, or if it was an instantaneous disappearance. They just disappeared right off the planet. Either way, it would have been the greatest thing, I couldn't think of a word right there, the greatest thing that ever took place on the planet. And no one wrote about it? No one wrote it down? Josephus was alive in AD 70. He was a Jewish scholar, historian. He wouldn't have known that all these people disappeared off the planet? Suddenly gone, hundreds of thousands or maybe more, maybe millions of Christians in the first century vanished or floated off into the sky and people actually watched them go. They say whatever the rapture was, it was like what happened to Jesus in Acts chapter 1. And when you ask them what happened to Jesus in Acts chapter 1, they say he literally floated away in the clouds while they watched him go up into the sky like Superman taking off. They say that's literally what happened in Acts chapter 1. And they say the rapture was like that. That's the proof text for the rapture. They say what happened to the saints in AD 70 was what happened to Jesus in Acts chapter 1. This guy says that repeatedly. Yet, other times he'll say, well, maybe it was that they disappeared. I don't know, he says. Okay, so which one is it? Either way, what is the rationale? Is it reasonable to suppose that countless people disappeared off the planet, either way in which they went, and nobody wrote it down? Not one person, not two, not 10, not 1,000, not 10,000? How many people would have said, my family members are gone. My co-workers are gone. We were working out in the fields and people disappeared literally right there, or they floated away and nobody wrote it down, and then nobody copied those letters and wrote it down and copied it in the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. We've got the ancient writings of Plato and Socrates and people before them. We've got ancient Babylonian script about how they were living their daily lives. We've got those today. We've unearthed those. And there was only how many letters were written from ancient people 5,000 years ago, a letter to their child, and we've discovered some of those. But people disappeared off the planet in the first century, countless people, and there's no record? Josephus, who was alive, and other historians of the day who were alive in the Roman Empire, weren't there Christians scattered all throughout the Roman Empire, living there? Nobody in Rome, nobody in Greece? Nobody in Jerusalem, in Israel, nobody in Palestine wrote about these things? Does that stand to reason? It does not. But they don't address that. What they do, here's how they do address it. When they're forced to, they say, I don't know, but I know the Bible says it. Well, does it? Doesn't it stand to reason? It's talking about something other than that. I think it does stand to reason. So they go to 1 Thessalonians 4 and they say, boom, there's heaven. They were caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. That's heaven. Okay, I never said the Bible never talks about heaven or an afterlife. But I'm just saying that I don't think that's what that passage is teaching. But they go to that one. And they go to 1 Corinthians 15. And they say, look, in the twinkling of an eye, they be transformed. That's heaven. That's the afterlife. That's where they were going. Well, there are many people who make many good arguments verse by verse through 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 that that's not what it was talking about. Then they go to John chapter 14. Now, catch this one. This guy in his video yesterday says, this main teacher of IO, or one of the main teachers, says, John chapter 14, Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare one of those mansions for you. Right? He says this, and when I come back, I'll bring you there to be with me where I am, in the Father's house, in those mansions. That's heaven. That's literally a celestial realm, an invisible kingdom where they all went in AD 70. All the 144,000 saved of Israel went to be, whether resurrected from biological death or raptured off the planet, they went to be with God in this invisible realm, which is the many mansions that Jesus mentions in John 14. Then the guy says this, are you ready? He says, well, I don't think they were literal mansions or literal apartments there. That's metaphor, of course. That's all metaphor. So they were caught away, harpazoed off into a literal celestial realm, into a metaphoric situation. I don't get it. Yes, it is metaphor. That's the problem. Right? They don't know what to do with it. It's metaphor for the temple, the spiritual temple, in which each individual Christian was a block, a temple stone. We learn that from Ephesians. We learn that from Peter. That each one of those Christian people alive in the first century was a stone being built into the spiritual temple. See, they make fun of me, even in the video that he made. He makes fun saying, they say that the temple is some spiritual thing, that it's within them, right? That heaven, that the kingdom was something within them, that it was a spiritual kingdom. No, it was a literal celestial realm they went to. Yet that literal celestial realm they went to, when Jesus describes it in John 14, they say he's describing that it's somehow metaphor. It just doesn't work, folks. It is metaphor. It's not a literal celestial realm they were taken off into. It was the spiritual temple. Let's see, let's put it this way. The temple was everything for Israel. I said this in the video that I put up yesterday. Their whole life was centered in their temple and in their holy city in Jerusalem, right? And when that temple was going away, it was devastation for them, because that temple was what made them God's exclusive covenant people. Okay? The temple in Jerusalem was a representation, the temple and Jerusalem itself were a representation of their covenant relationship with God. The temple was everything, all of their lives, all of the feasts, all of the sacrifices, the priesthood, everything that made them God's exclusive covenant people in that special way, although foreigners could enter into that covenant. But what made them the exclusive covenant people that you had to come into was their temple system, was their priesthood, was their sacrificial system, were their feast days. Every day of their lives was caught up, if you will, in this temple experience. Without the temple, you're nothing, you're nobody as a Jew. It's over. So that was going away in AD 70, and there was a new temple experience coming, which would be individual believers with the kingdom within them. It would no longer be tied to a geographical location, to a material building, to priests, and to the blood of animals. That's what made the gospel such an amazing message. That's what made, these guys will always say, especially this guy, this leader of IO, what were they waiting for? If they were transformed in the twinkling of an eye and they were resurrected and they were in this new life, if it wasn't a celestial kingdom they were taken off into, what was it? Big deal. Here's what he says. He says, what is it? In AD 70, when the old system was destroyed, what happened to them? Did they get goosebumps all of a sudden? That was the kingdom? That they got goosebumps? No, my friend. The kingdom was, the resurrection life was, there's no longer that whole system that your entire lives for 2,000 years revolved around. That's all they knew. Life apart from the temple was unthinkable to a Jew, to an Israelite. Everything revolved around it. There was no relationship with God without it. And the message of the gospel was, that's changing. In your lifetime, in this generation, that's going away, and something brand new, a new way to have covenant with God is coming that's not tied to any of that. Wait a minute, the Jew says, are you saying the temple? Our fathers and their fathers and their fathers, all the way back to Moses and the tabernacle, to Abraham even, to Adam and the altars and the sacrifices, all the way back. That's changing. We don't need that anymore. Circumcision, the priesthood, the feasts. Right, that's all going away, and now it will be something brand new where you will not need any of that. And all peoples can just worship God from the heart. You're telling me that's a lot more than some goosebumps. They were being snatched away from the old system into that new system of freedom. The curse, all of that was a part of the curse they were under. And that's too much to go into here. I've done it in other videos. That was the ministry of death and condemnation that Paul talked about. And this guy, this IO leader, knows that it was the ministry of death and condemnation. And they were taken out of that into this freedom where none of that was necessary anymore. No more feast days, no more Jerusalem, no more Holy Land, no more temple system, no more sacrifices on your behalf, no more tithes and offerings. Wow, and much more. No more you can't eat this, or you can't touch that, or you can't go here, or you can't fellowship with these people. Goosebumps? Brother, you need to study the Bible a little harder. No offense. But anyway, back to the heaven thing. So they go to 1 Thessalonians, they go to 1 Corinthians, and they use those passages to say heaven. Then he went to John 14 and talked about the many mansions, which he says is a literal heaven. Boom, there it is. There's literal heaven. The Bible talks about it constantly. They were all going there. Yet he says, well, it wasn't a literal temple, because he says, in my Father's house, that's the temple. There are many mansions. In the literal material temple, there were apartment buildings built around the walls of the temple where the leaders of the temple system lived in these apartments because they worked in the temple. And Jesus says, in the new temple, which is made up of you, individual Christians, the community of faith, you're the new temple. There will no longer be a material temple. So in that new temple, in the new kingdom experience, you are the blocks of the temple. So when Jesus says, in my Father's house, that is that new temple, there are many apartments. It's metaphor. He's not talking about a literal heaven. He says, I go to prepare a place for you, because during that 40-year transition period, he was putting all his enemies under his feet. He was preparing the new kingdom. He was preparing the way for it to arrive. And he was doing away with the old. That's the putting all of his enemies under his feet. That's how he was preparing the place for them. And he was with them as they were preaching the gospel, bringing out the remnant who would come in and be the founding fathers of that new temple, that new kingdom, that new Jerusalem, because the old was disappearing. So in one side of his mouth, he says it's heaven, and the other side he says, but it's metaphor. It's in heaven, but it's metaphoric. I say it's metaphor for the new kingdom. Then he does one that I just couldn't believe. He says, you want to talk about heaven? Go to 1 Corinthians, he says. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9. But just as it is written, things which eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, and which has not entered into the heart of a man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. He says, that's heaven. That's the celestial realm. That's the invisible place. Things eye has not seen, things ear has not heard, things which man has not conceived of. This is heaven. This is the invisible celestial kingdom. Really? No. He's quoting here from Isaiah 64. And Isaiah 64 is simple. Let's look at it. Well, let's exposit this chapter a little, then we'll go. All right? Let's begin verse 1, chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians. Watch this now. And when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, right? Man's wisdom, we'll see that in a minute, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Right? That's the gospel. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Holy Spirit and of power, of dunamis, the power of the Spirit, miraculous power, miraculous wisdom, things that man could not know. The mysteries that Paul talks about of the gospel and of the last days. Verse 5, so that your faith sorry about that. Watch this. So that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Now, when he says the wisdom of men here, he's talking about the leaders of Jerusalem, the leaders of the Jews. And we're going to see that in a second. He said, I didn't come to you speaking Judaism and their wisdom, the wisdom of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the elders. I didn't come to you with the wisdom of men. We preach Christ and him crucified. We preach the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. We preach something people haven't heard before. Watch this. Yet we do speak a wisdom among those who are mature, a wisdom, however, not of this age. We speak a wisdom not of this age, the old covenant age. We don't speak an old covenant wisdom like the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders. We don't teach their teachings. Watch this. We speak a wisdom not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age. There it is. Who are passing away. The rulers of that age were passing away along with that old covenant age. The old covenant rulers, with the old covenant temple system, were passing away with that whole old covenant system itself. Watch this. But we speak a wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages to our glory. Right? We would be the ones who would be alive in the generation in which these things would change. Watch this. Verse 8, the wisdom that I'm talking about, which none of the rulers of this age have understood. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But just as it is written, then he quotes Isaiah, what eye has not seen, nor ear has not heard, nor that which has not entered into the heart of an Israelite, into the heart of man, this is what God has prepared for those who love him. He's not talking about a celestial realm in an invisible place somewhere off beyond the galaxies, beyond the universes. He's talking about the wisdom of the old age, the teachings, the covenant teachings of the old age as opposed to the covenant teachings of the age to come, the new kingdom age. That's what the eye of the old rulers had not seen, nor their ear heard, nor their minds perceived. They don't understand. That's the context of what he's saying. He says, they don't get it, what we're preaching. And he says, just as it is written. Then he quotes Isaiah 64:4. What eye has not seen. But this guy says, this is heaven. This is what's going to happen what would happen to them when they all got to heaven. They would see things that the eyes never seen before. They would hear things that the ears never heard before. Nope. Then he equates this with 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and Paul saying, I saw things in the third heaven in paradise that I wasn't able to speak about. He says, this is that. Wrong. So if he's wrong here, perhaps he's wrong about 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, if you go back and you look at Isaiah, it's exactly that. What's the context here? Verse 3 of Isaiah 64. He's talking to the Lord. When you did awesome things which we did not expect back in the day of Israel, early days, right? You came down on the mountain and the mountains quaked at your presence. This is like Sinai with Moses, so forth. For from days of old, since that time, watch this, they, Israel, since from those old days, right? They have not heard, nor perceived by ear, nor eye has not seen any God besides you. Paul is quoting this verse. What's the context here? That Israel had not understood God in the way that they did previously for a long time. It's all about the Jews and their understanding of God's truth, not about an invisible celestial realm. Well, there's much more I'd like to say about it. He goes on in this video and calls me, without naming me, but I know that he's talking about me, calls me a bonehead, and a couple other choice words there, which is fine with me, because we need to let the scripture speak, right? One last thing he likes to do, and I don't think this guy can make a teaching without going to Revelation chapter 7 or 14 and talking about the 144,000 standing before the throne. He says, you see, whatever else, there it is. Where were the 144,000 at the end? They were before the throne. That means, boom, there it is. They were in heaven in a celestial realm. And I've said this over and over in other videos. The book is metaphor. The whole book almost is symbolism. For those of you who watch my videos, forgive me, but I'm going to repeat myself here. Is the giant woman of Revelation chapter 12 a giant woman? Are the dragons literal dragons? Are the four horses of the apocalypse literally horses? We could go on and on about the book of Revelation. Are the lampstands literal lampstands? Are the olive trees literal olive trees? No, it's all symbolic. It's symbolic representations in visions that God is giving to John that represent human things that were taking place for Israel on the planet in the first century. Therefore, the throne is not literal either. And the beast with the eyes all around their head and the crystal sea flowing out from underneath the throne, that stuff's mentioned all throughout the Old Testament. These are quotes and allusions to Old Testament passages of Scripture. And those things existed back then too. So if they existed back then, they weren't in heaven. They were talking about things that would happen to Israel on planet Earth, in Palestine and the surrounding areas. So, there are passages in the Old Testament where God says, I will make my throne in your temple. In your temple, I have set up my throne. Was there a literal throne in the temple in ancient Israel where God was sitting on a chair and you could go in and see him sitting there and you could come before his throne? Obviously not. What was he saying? He's saying in the new temple, which we've talked about already, is made up collectively of the community of the saints, they are the new blocks in the temple because it's a spiritual temple. The old temple was only a picture, a type, a prototype of the spiritual temple that was to come in the last days and go on forever. So doesn't it make sense in Revelation that God's throne is in that temple too? That he would set up his throne in that temple? Don't we see that in Revelation chapter 21 and 22? That God and Jesus and the Father are seated on the thrones in the new temple? That's not literal either. But this guy says, no. I know the whole book is symbolic. No, the dragons are not the dragons, and the giant woman is not the giant woman, and the lampstands are not lampstands, and the stars are not stars, right? And the serpent is not the serpent, and the beast is not the beast. But the throne is the throne.